All right, good day everybody. My name is Dano from Shurun Press, and welcome to our second video. In the last video, I sort of went a bit over time. I hope this video won't go too long, but because I'm more relaxed talking like this, videos tend to go over. So bear with me if this is a little long. Today, I'd just like to talk about the call for submissions that we've just put out called Minority Blues. So what exactly are we looking for in a short story or poem? Well, basically, we're trying to show that minorities should not be defined as victims, as they often are in the media, in people's sort of general opinion about them. So to look into this, I'd like to look at Can the Subaltern Speak by the philosopher Gayatri Spivak. So just reading a little bit of Spivak here. She writes that in post-colonial studies and in critical theory, the term subaltern designates and identifies the colonial populations who are socially, politically, and geographically excluded from the hierarchy of power of an imperial colony and from the metropolitan homeland of an empire. In post-colonial theory, the term subaltern describes the lower social classes and the other social groups displaced to the margins of society in an imperial colony. A subaltern is a native man or woman without human agency, as defined by his and her social status. Immediately, when I read something like that, it makes me think about two groups. There might be more, but just two groups in Malaysia, namely the Rohingya, who are stateless, and various Orang Asli. These subaltern minorities, what it means by exclusion is that they are devoid of this agency to speak for themselves because of a lack of either citizenship or just general power and credibility that society affords them. I'd like to read a bit more, not from Spivak, but by the anthropologist Sawawi Ibrahim. He writes that my present response to any form of representation of the other, a phrase, a word, or even an exclamation uttered by the other in the text, is privileged by the authorial role of the ethnographer. What that means is when he is reading all these texts to do with this subaltern or post-colonial subjects, the writer is elevated to a sort of privileged position because of the reasons we just spoke before, because we're forever on the outside of these subaltern communities. So in short story submissions of poetry, it's important to consider this fact because we can't possibly put ourselves in the position of these marginalized groups. That's the whole point of subaltern, is that we might think that, for example, myself as a Chinese minority in Malaysia, we might think that we're also, so to speak, discriminated and marginalized, but we have no idea compared to those lower down the tier, which shouldn't be there, obviously. I'd like to read a bit about, okay, so Spivak writes, so the subaltern has no voice, and other minorities also may not have that much of a voice, but these minorities are still able to participate in discourse, as I am doing now. Sorry, disclaimer, that was my note, that wasn't Spivak. So Spivak writes here, subaltern is not just a classy word for oppressed, for the other, for somebody who's not getting a piece of the pie. In post-colonial terms, everything that has limited or no access to the cultural imperialism is subaltern. It's within the space of difference. Now, who would say that's just the oppressed? The working class is oppressed, but it's not subaltern. Many people want to claim the condition of subalternity. They are the least interesting and the most dangerous. I mean, just by being a discriminated against minority on the university campus, they don't need the word subaltern. They should see what the mechanics of the discrimination are. They are within the hegemonic discourse, wanting a piece of the pie and not being allowed. So let them speak, use this hegemonic discourse, but they should not call themselves subaltern. So I want to come back to that in a little bit. Let me just read you a little bit more. Just building on that, so we can immediately see that minority groups that have the power of language and agency, they should not, and in fact, many people do not feel that much discriminated against, even though, so for example, various Chinese groups that are significantly wealthier, but they're not afforded the same rights, for example, as a Bumiputra. They don't have these rights to discounts, cheaper housing, we're not going to go into that. But these groups, they are using this kind of agency at times not to better the status quo, but to kind of show that capital is, above all else. So you can have laws in the constitution, but it is these groups that control these, money at the end of the day, that hold this kind of privilege over a lot of others. You can think about expats in that regard as well. But it's important for these groups to develop a heightened sense of class consciousness, if possible. And that's what we're also aiming to do as a publisher, to elevate, just the general consciousness of our readers. So I'm going to read more from Zawawi Ibrahim, who writes that changing historical and material conditions in society may indeed help to foster the deconstructing rather than the internalizing process. And as such a process gains more momentum and group solidarity, it may be possible to detect the beginning of a counter or subaltern discourse in the making, as the subjugated themselves move to formulate, articulate, and even politically assert their own truth and interpretation based on a set of different terms of reference and genealogy to offer an alternative to the dominant discourse of the day. A lot of what Ibrahim writes about is empowering, to empower marginalized Orang Asli groups in Borneo. And I'm going to put a link to his paper, which I very quickly read just now in preparation for today's video. So I don't claim to know his theories in and out, but it's a very good read. I would recommend anyone who is looking at Malaysian post-colonial theory, apart from if you want to read also Syed Hussein Alatas. Zawawi Ibrahim's work is pretty great as well. But let's go back to Syed Hussein, who of course wrote the very famous The Myth of the Lazy Native. So he writes about Malays, Filipinos, and Javanese during 16th to 20th century colonial capitalism, and where this idea of laziness and indolence was posited as a trait by the British imperials, while in actual fact it was the colonials who stopped the merchant class from sort of rising and appearing again. They favored peasants which were backed by the capitalists with labor inputs over the traditional farmers and cultivators who were just seeking enough a means to feed their families. with the land, with the rice. Back then, the Malay race was oppressed. I don't want to say that the Malay race isn't completely not oppressed today, um, because there are, even though with Bhumi rights, there's a lot of still marginalized, poor, um, less fortunate groups in the country. But certainly today, in the post-colonial era, 60 plus years after independence, um, it's evident that there's a few new groups that are marginalized in at first the Orang Asli, and now uh, refugees or even migrant workers. So I've written a few notes here. The argument is always for a Malaysian's Malaysia. That's the it's a age-old, very old adage that it's political. It sort of rings true when you first hear it. So Malaysians, Malaysia, to grant privileges to Malaysian citizens, and maybe not intentionally, but through these kind of policies to marginalize any subaltern community. So actually that idea, Malaysians, Malaysia, goes against the Act 153 of the Constitution, which grants Bumiputra privileges. So what people don't realize about these two conflicting ideas is that they are both inherently very conservative ideas that sort of overly racialize our politics in this land. And it is the government who advocates and balances the timing, the way these slogans are said, when to actually push slogans like this to maintain control over a people. And what they do is, through these policies, they actually give back the least to these communities that vote and support, a party, while they siphon and they take the most for themselves, behind closed doors. So you might wonder, like, why am I, stressing about all of this, and why am I putting out, using the publisher to put out a call for submission for a topic such as minority blues. It's because I feel it's very important for us to develop a renewed, a progressive class consciousness. And I'm not saying you should go to, radical means or crazy protests. I mean, not crazy protests. I mean, there's no protest that is crazy to me. But what I'm trying to say is you don't have to be too extreme to make a difference. Consciousness comes from accepting, growth, the growth of yourself and the growth of others, to actually be acceptive of new possibilities, narratives, understanding where each and every group within our country and the world is coming from. So people need to be conscious of the power of voice, for at times it is the only thing left that is in our possession and control. Class consciousness should really be developed as a unified culture, because I feel that Malaysia is already halfway there. The younger generation compared when I was growing up, is certainly more vocal, and they know the ways in which to be vocal. You can see that in the recent Undi 18 demonstrations, which were really great, I feel. So I think that the politics and inherent racist laws given through our constitution are very flawed, without a doubt. That's the first thing many people must realize. And a lot of people might realize it, but they ask, what am I to do about it? these are questions we must ask ourselves, over time. And conversation will help it will help push it forward, you know. It's good to talk about it instead of avoid it. So in conclusion, even though I'm just really talking in generalities here, minorities should not be just defined in terms of being a lesser number. More consideration has to be given to the material conditions which enabled through government policies, which are really just historically racist ideas that were passed down since, the British colonial days. Hopefully that video would be beneficial to our viewers, especially those writers who want to enter our call for submissions, which is Minority Blues. The submissions are now open. Yeah, I mean, you can openly write in. And the deadline is July 31st, 2021. So thank you very much, and we'll see you in the next video.